marchers were about to return to Wonderkop.
To disperse, I agree with that, yes.
High alert or red alert? He says he realized, well, the levels of aggression, the number of workers involved were unusual, very disturbing.
Yes.
People were joining the crowd from Korea and from other mines. Did that lead to high alert or red alert?
It was still on orange alert at that point.
High alert, I take it.
That's high alert.
So high alert's orange, and red alert is above that.
It's above that, that's correct.
Now, this is a very important moment in the history of what then develops, is it not, Mr. Blow? You have both yourself and Mr. Sinclair coming to this assessment of the mood of the crowd.
Yes.
It's an alarming assessment, and the important question that flows from it, of course, is what you, Mr. Sinclair, and others in the leadership of security did thereafter.
Yes. Mr. Chair, what we then did was to ensure that we bring in the extra resources to manage the unfolding events. We started having conversations with private security people like Protea Coin Security. We engaged with our counterparts at processing to give us more security so we could manage the strike. And we ensured that that evening we are now going to assess the situation further and see whether the people have dispersed completely, and that the things that we would be doing henceforth would be commensurate to manage the labor unrest as we saw it.
Let me take you to paragraph 21 of your statement, quadruple R 1.3. It reads as follows: although the crowd had dispersed, it had become apparent that internally there was a need for Lonmin to establish an operations center which combined the efforts of Lonmin security and the emergency and disaster management. The idea was to centralize all calls and log them in a Lonmin joint central center which would monitor the developments and coordinate any responses. And then you go on to something
Yes.
different.
Yes.
That's all that you have to say about what you did and what you decided, correct?
Correct.
And if we can have a look at Mr. Sinclair's statement, which is quadruple F1. I'm afraid that I don't have a paragraph reference, but if we can just scroll through, but I can just summarize it whilst Craig is having a look for that. Mr. Sinclair mentions the dispersal, and the next thing that he deals with in his statement are events on the 11th. He has nothing to say at all about any interaction or discussions or decisions immediately after the dispersal of these strikers. Now, yes, thank you. Just go up. Let's continue. Thursday, go to 10 August. Yes. Carry on. Carry on. Yes, stop there. Just go up a bit. Paragraph 28, thereafter the crowd, showing displeasure and displaying aggressive behavior, dispersed and intimated that management would have to take the consequences and would be impossible for what was to happen. The behavior and number of workers involved were unusual and not something I'd previously experienced. And then he goes on to Saturday, 11 August. So in his statement, as I said, he says nothing about any discussions or decisions. Now, I want to raise something general, in general terms with you, but particularly in the context of the situation that afternoon, the early afternoon of 10 August.
Yes.
Because what is not apparent from your statement, certainly not apparent from Mr. Sinclair's statement, also not apparent from the entries in the log as I read them, is that there was interaction and discussion between you, Mr. Sinclair, and the others in the leadership of the security along the lines of doing the predicting that the procedures memorandum or document requires, that you assess in order to predict the consequences. And I want to focus on that.
Yeah.
Prediction seems to me to require that you and your colleagues should have sat there, you should have compared notes. I thought that they looked very aggressive. What did you think? I too. I thought it very disturbing. What do we think that they may do next?
Okay.
What are they going to do? They've been turned away by management. What are the likely scenarios? And I want to use that word scenarios deliberately.
Yes.
What are the scenarios? And once we identify the possible scenarios, we can then make an assessment of the risk profile relating to those different scenarios, and then make an informed assessment of what the security capacity is in respect of them,
Yes.
what deployments are possible, whether they would be effective deployments, and questions of that sort.
Yes.
And why I particularly raise that for your consideration, and I'd be glad if you'd comment in a moment, is that I'm going to suggest to you that one of the scenarios that a brainstorming session of that kind would very likely have produced had it taken place in the way that I describe, is that the one scenario would be, well, they may take action against people who continue to work. They may take action against NUM, because NUM has set itself in opposition to our strike.
Yes.
And anyone who opposes our strike is a problem for the efficacy of our strike, that sort of thing. And that had there been that kind of examination and prediction process,
Yes.
then the march to the NUM office in the morning of the following day might not have been that unexpected. You follow the drift of what I'm putting to you.
I follow, yes.
All right, and if you could give us your comments.
Before you give us your comments, can I just ask you a further question linked to the one that you've been asked?
Yes.
Were you in contact in any way with the NUM officials? Did you know that NUM was minded to escort those who wanted to work to the shafts, to protect them, to enable them, in fact, to go to the shafts? Did you know that that was what NUM was going to do?
Mr. Chairperson, I did not know beforehand that NUM had planned to escort them. It became apparent during that evening and the next morning on Saturday.
So it became apparent already on the Friday evening.
Yes.
Take it was also foreseeable that the strikers wouldn't like that.
Correct.
So that would increase the risk of an attack by them on the NUM office on the Saturday morning.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Blow, yes, on that specifically and generally, why there does not seem to have been that kind of engagement where scenarios are identified, evaluated, and decisions taken on that basis. Is that something that you can assist us with?
Mr. Chairman, after the strikers had dispersed, we received later in that afternoon information that they wanted to target employees that are not participating in their strike. We had posted members of security on the evening of Friday. I know for a fact, though I was not there, I was informed that towards the Roland Shaft four-way crossing, there were members that were coming from the Vonokop side, walking because it's close by, and they normally do this, that had been coming to work and that they were being intimidated and that security had to intervene themselves by protecting these members that wanted to come to work. I was informed of such an intervention, that SAPS were also called out. As to whether NUM themselves were going to escort people, like I said to Mr. Chairman, I didn't know beforehand. I learned afterwards. The attack on the NUM offices, were we aware that it was going to be attacking the NUM offices?
It isn't whether you were aware that it was going to happen.
Yes.
Whether you were aware that it was something that might well happen. In other words, it was on this prediction exercise that Mr. Tip spoke to you about. Was it considered as something that might well happen?
Mr. Chairman?
Not necessarily would happen.
Yes.
Might well happen.
Yes. We had never experienced before any attack on specifically, for example, NUM officers. Our considerations were that whenever there were strikers or community people, they would attack Lonmin property and intimidate people. Therefore, our strategy was immediately to protect our immediate areas in the vicinity. And I can make examples such as the power stations, the Andrew Safi hospitals, but there has never been any attempt in specifically going and attack NUM. But there were dissatisfaction on NUM even as early as 2011.
Did you know that the NUM office had been attacked at Impala? You remember Mr. Tip took you
Yes.
to that. You told us you weren't directly in contact with your opposite numbers at Impala, but
Yeah.
you were indirectly via your opposite numbers at Anglo-Patch, you remember? Did you know that the NUM office had been attacked at Impala by strikers who were busy with various striking activities?
Mr. Chairman, I did not know at that point in time. On that Friday afternoon, Friday evening, I had no knowledge, not at all.
One question I should have asked you earlier. Did you have this brainstorming session that Mr. Tip refers to that seems to be mandated in the procedure document that we looked at, where you get together, try to predict what's likely to happen? Did you actually have such a session?
Correct.
How long did it last?
Normally, those briefings would not last for more than an hour. And this is where we would have concentrated on the areas that we knew were likely to be targeted.
So did you have one for an hour on this occasion? Never mind what happened normally.
Yes.
On the afternoon of the 10th, did you have a briefing session for an hour or more?
Or less, for an hour or
Well,
less.
What was it? Can you tell us? Are there minutes of the briefing session that you had?
Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid, as has been shown earlier, our record keeping was not the best at the time.
Does that mean you had a session, you can't tell us how long it lasted, and there should have been records kept, but they weren't. Is that what you're telling me?
That would be my submission, yes.
Oh, no, never mind your submission, that's your evidence.
I beg your pardon, my evidence, yes.
Thanks.
Were there any plans and areas of deployment that were put up on your board? Was that stored at all? Was that recorded? The plan of action?
Commissioner, there were discussions as to where we would deploy, and if my recollection serves me correctly, we knew exactly how many deployments we would have where. And to that, like I said, we would use boards, we would use whiteboards and surface plans to plot on them where we are going to put which resources.
And those would be recorded and stored somewhere,
That is correct.
and they would be available if necessary.
If necessary, that's correct.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Blow.
Mr. Blow, I think it'll be helpful dealing with this particular topic to get quadruple E 19.1 back on the screen. That's the log.
But before that, Mr. Blow, there was a request from NUM for security at a meeting they were having on the late afternoon of the 10th, and that request was declined. You say so in paragraph 22 of your statement.
May I just go there, please, Commissioner? Is that the one involving
It's on page...
Mr. Larry Dietrich or...
yes, that's right, Mr. Dietrich, yes. It's on page 20 of the bundle that's been given to us.
It's now on the screen.
Yes.
Quadruple R 1.3, paragraph 22.
Yes, Ms. Commissioner?
Were you aware of the refusal of that request?
I only became... If I can just refer to that paragraph, if I may. As it states there, Commissioner, that per the email, shortly after 7 p.m., there was a decline. And this is after the meeting would have taken place at 5 p.m.
I couldn't understand. They asked you at 4 o'clock
Yes.
for security presence. The meeting was going to be at 5, and at 7 o'clock, Mr. Dietrich said your application is declined. I mean, what's the good of that? If they're going to have a meeting at 5, what's the point of telling them 2 hours later, after the meeting was supposed to take place, that their request is declined? I mean, that's not a business-like way of doing things, is it?
Mr. Commissioner, I note that, but I really wouldn't know. I see that Mr. Dietrich would have responded at 7 p.m. And that is all on email.
Let us proceed with quadruple E19, please. We're looking for 10 August, 1358. Yes, that's it. Thank you. Mr. Blow, you'll see there, if you look at the second column, 1355, the group dismissed from Vonderkorp Stadium. Correct?
Yes, I note that.
So this particular march has come to an end. And 3 minutes later, at 1358, there is the debrief by Mr. Sinclair. Now, this is the one of the meetings that I asked you about because your initials don't appear there, and you thought that you hadn't attended it. And it now becomes quite important to be certain whether or not you were there. And if you weren't there, you should perhaps tell us why you were not there. Because this is now 3 minutes after the end. It is the moment, as I said earlier, where the evaluation, the scenarios, identification, the talk about what might happen, the contingent planning, etc., should take place. It would be surprising, would it not, if you were not present?
Mr. Chair, I wish to comment as follows. I'm not really going to be 100% in reminding everything that would have happened at that time. However, there were meetings that were held and either chaired by Mr. Sinclair or myself or other members of the security management team. And on the basis of my name not appearing there, I take it that I probably would not have attended this specific meeting. There would be nothing wrong if I hadn't attended it. It would simply be that I was probably busy with other tasks.
Well, you know, that's, I'm just going to press you a little on that because I want to underline what I said to you. That you're the security manager at Lonmin. You are the person who is charged with all the functions in the procedures document that we dealt with earlier.
Correct.
It's your responsibility, in fact, to see to it that that there is the process of prediction and the process of decision and strategy making, etc. Is it not?
Correct.
And here we are to repeat 3 minutes after the group is dispersed. Surely it was incumbent on you to be part of that discussion?
That is incorrect, Mr. Chair. If we looked, for example, at the procedure, it said the manager mining security or such an appointed person. And there are many instances where if I could not make it myself, somebody else would be there, and in this instance, I note that it was Mr. Sinclair. I have mentioned also that there are many instances that I would be probably busy with other tasks.
All right, well, I can't imagine a more important one than the one that I've described, but let's look at what is actually noted here in the log. There's identification of various sections, presumably with representatives present. And then just above where you see 1358, there's an entry saying there was no good communication between management and workers. Do you see that?
I see that, yes, Mr. Chair.
I'm going to ask you about that, but let me just interpose a question. You've told us that one of the purposes of having this log is that you can jog your recollection or understanding of what took place. You were at the very next meeting at 15:10, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Just an hour or so later. So you could have looked at this log to see what had been discussed previously.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes. All right. Mr. Blow, I'm going to ask you about the position of management, but I'm just going to scroll very quickly down all these items. You see the next one, management are not going to tolerate disruptions. The workers must follow procedure. No work, no pay rule will apply. Those who do not report for duty will be dismissed. If workers participate in the illegal march, they will all be dismissed. They will be dismissed. Management can't make decisions sitting in the office. They must allow people on the ground to make decisions, and I'll come back to that as well. And then it says Arthur and Ludic to communicate about the access. SAPS asked if security have information committees, and they were informed that crime intelligence is on the ground gathering information. Security and D&DM not to address the media. The media must follow the right channels. PW to organize the third RU from Protea. What is an RU, incidentally?
It loosely translates to a hard-skin vehicle. It's response units.
Response unit, thank
Yes.
you. PW, the command structure for the weekend, and then briefing on the 11th of August at 8:30. Now, looking at all those entries, what is, on my reading, utterly not to be found is any indication of a discussion about scenarios and what the strikers may do and what we need to plan for and what deployments need to be made, etc. So that it is, for me, a question that is important but is nowhere addressed in that record of the discussion. Can you assist us with that?
Mr. Chairman, I know that I have said this is a memory jogger, but when you do a log of this nature, you are not going to be recording every action that you take. for example, where it says Pierre to organize the third RU from Protea, obviously he's going to have actions behind the scenes that he will do. And secondly, where it says Pierre command structure for the weekend, that is an indication that the deployment for the weekend will be discussed and that it will be Pierre who's going to be the command structure really. I don't know how to put it maybe in more simpler terms. Maybe, Mr. Chair, I don't know whether you are following me or not following me. But what I'm trying to say here, I know that for a fact that there are a lot of things that we did during this time and that are not on this log sheet.
Well, I'm not going to recycle the topic, but I just want to put to you one fairly broadly phrased proposition, which is that to record that PW is to organize another reaction unit from Protea is a specific step, and that is the sort of thing one would expect to see. But when one is talking about what is likely to be the circumstance that we will need to deal with over the weekend, that should surely have found its way into being recorded. What that, if I may add, without becoming too burdensome with the length of my question, to say, well, PW has the command structure, is to say, well, he's going to be the person who will react to whatever happens. Isn't that the effect of it?
I understand, yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
And I'm putting to you very, very specifically that it is a grave shortcoming that PW Botha we're talking about, is a senior security officer, he's not a manager, that he should be left to make up his own mind as to what should take place, rather than that the senior management, you and Mr. Sinclair and the others, should have worked out what the likely scenarios are that Mr. PW might have to confront and what he should then do if any of those eventualities in fact presented themselves. Would that not have been a more effective way and in accordance with the requirements of the procedures document?
Mr. Chairman, let me perhaps just correct first before responding. Mr. P.W. Botha is not a senior security officer. He is a security superintendent, and there's a vast difference between the two. And indeed, security superintendents assume a penultimate role before they can be managers. So from there, if they are promoted, they become a manager. They are entrusted with certain decision-making capabilities. And that recording in that log means that he would be the person on the ground for the weekend, supported by the security management team. That is what is meant by that. And really, I am noting that not everything that we would have done would have been put in a log sheet. Not every decision that we would have taken would have been put on that log sheet.
Mr. Blow, given your comments about the numbers being unusually large and the threats and the unusual mood and the behavior of the crowd, there appears to be no recording of the seriousness of the situation, nor any appreciation of whether bringing in one hard-skinned vehicle would be sufficient if there were any eventualities. There seems to be no recording of that at all.
Commissioner, in hindsight, I believe we should have recorded it more specifically to talk to these issues. But if PFA was to bring an additional hardskin, at the time we had 2, and it would have meant that our mine is divided into 3 areas, Career, Western and Eastern, that we would deploy 1 hard skin per area. Noting the unusual behavior when these strikers dispersed, but we believed at the time the places that would likely to be targeted would have been the Lonmin infrastructure and the people that would want to report to work. And our capacity augmented by the additional resources we would get, we believed at the time, would be sufficient to cover all areas. I do note, however, that those specific discussions were not logged, and I say in hindsight, we should have logged those.
Not only not logged, they weren't minuted either.
When minuted.
And the minutes, we went through that before. It should have happened. There's
Yes.
no explanation as to why it wasn't done. Is there?
Noted, Mr. Chair.
You agree with me, there's no explanation as to why that wasn't done?
I wouldn't know. The only thing I can think, and this is now 2 years later, I may be so wrong, but for me is to state to the Commission what I think would have happened, and that perhaps the entries that were supposed to be made were not made, and I cannot tell for what reasons.
There's no explanation.
Exactly.
Isn't that so? Should have been done, wasn't done, no explanation. That, all those three points are correct, aren't they?
It should have been done.
Yeah,
It
okay.
wasn't done.
And you
Yes,
don't know why.
and I don't know why it
So
wasn't
there's no
done.
explanation.
Yes,
Thanks.
yes.
Your comment that the arrangements were sufficient as at this point in time, when did that opinion change? When is the first time that it would have occurred to you that these arrangements might not have been sufficient?
Commissioner, when we saw the sort of sustained action, and particularly on the Sunday morning, that is where we realized that we were dealing with a different strike, certainly than all previous strikes.
So as your answer, the first time you would appreciate that the arrangements were insufficient would have been the Sunday the 12th?
Sunday the 12th, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Blow, we'll have to debate at some stage why Sunday the 12th is referred to you in that way, when Saturday the 11th was also an event that was unprecedented, wasn't it, in terms of your security history?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
We'll come to what should have happened with that, but
Yes.
let us, for the moment, just continue with with this log whilst we have it on screen. The second briefing that is referred to there at 15:10, you can see it all. You were present there, certainly. And the only items that are discussed, we don't even need to look at the details, are three comments about buses.
Yes.
That's all. Otherwise, nothing whatsoever in respect of security arrangements or deployments.
Yes.
Now, if you go down a little further, you will see, just as an example, at 16:30, this is now very shortly after the conclusion of that debriefing. There is the first recorded instance of a report concerning intimidation at Wonderkop, and as it happens, it's in the vicinity of the NUM offices.
Yes.
And as you know, we don't need to work through them all. There are, throughout the evening and even into the night, other recordals of reports of intimidation, acts of violence, and the like,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
As well as the chairperson raised with you earlier, the very important fact that there are a number of reports of NUM members and officials escorting persons to work.
Yes.
And you've already fairly acknowledged that that was likely to seriously displease those who were on strike.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
They would be angered by it.
Yes.
Now, what I want to ask you is, as events of that kind unfold, as reports of that kind unfold, or come in to the JOC and are recorded, was there a system for a person such as yourself to be kept up to date with events like that? Because on the face of it, where you have intimidation, acts of violence, NIM doing escorting functions, there must surely be an increase in the prospect of violence.
Yes.
Now, would that be reported to you telephonically? Would somebody get hold of you to say, this is what is happening? What do we do to modify our situation? Do we need specific arrangements in place, or do you just leave everything on a reactive basis?
Mr. Chair, yes, they were communicated to myself, and I would communicate upwards through, for example, we've mentioned Graham Sinclair here, and I know he would also be communicating upwards. But these events, as they unfolded that evening, in my mind and in our mind at the time, they were consistent with events that had been happening, like at the career area, where people were being intimidated for not, or rather for going to work against the will of the worker committees at the time. And the strategy we put in place was to deploy security on the ground, as we have done there on this particular day. For example, we had security deployments where we knew within that area of Vonnegut, Roland Shaft, or let me rather say the Western Platinum mine, we were covering that to what we believe at the time was sufficient.
To prevent intimidation.
They were sufficient in our mind, Mr. Chair, to protect the people that work for Lonmin, that want to go to work, yes, as well as the property.
In other words, to prevent intimidation and protect your property.
Yes.
And did you get any reports later as to how, in the course of the Friday evening, early Saturday morning, as to how successful those attempts to prevent intimidation had been? Whether people were still intimidated and didn't go to work, or whether everybody who wanted to go to work was able to do so because there was no intimidation, or no successful intimidation. Did you get any reports about that?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we got reports that towards Vonnegut, towards Roland Shaft from Vonnegut, people were intimidated, security intervened, they repelled those that intimidated, and people were able to go to work.
When we reach a suitable stage, we'll take the teardrop, but it's in your hands to tell me when that will be.
No, it would be fine.
Well,
Thank
Mr.
you, Chair.
Tip has decreed that we'll take the teardrop down, so we will.